Hello and welcome to the second part of Chapter 8's video. Here we start talking about the effective rate of protection of a tariff. So the effective rate of protection of an individual country is defined as the percentage by which the entire set of a nation's trade barriers raises the industry's value added per unit of output. Why is this kind of essential to understand? Well, the reason why is that, of course, we might have components that have to be imported for that particular product. And so this is a good way of finding out, what the mix is of components that are imported for a product that suffer a tariff, and yet they might, the good is produced within the country or assembled within the country, and yet it does have tariffs on it, you see. So to calculate the total effective rate of protection, we got to factor that into our calculation. So the effective rate of protection we calculate for an industry as V prime, that's the value added under tariffs, minus the value added under free trade, and over, so as a percentage of the value added under free trade. So let's see how we calculate that. So let's say we had a bicycle that we import for $300. The unit cost of the material and components, in other words, the inputs to that, are $220, and then the unit value added is $80. So that's like the profit, I suppose one might say. Now, if we have a 10% tariff on bicycles and 5% tariff on inputs, so on the components that are used to manufacture a bike, if we wanted to do that in the US, then what we need to do is to calculate the total tariff base for the bicycle industry. And so we'd look at the unit cost of material and component inputs, and we'd want to note that there's a 5% tariff on those inputs. So we take the 220 under free trade, we add 5%, that gets us to 231. Now the actual bike, if we're going to import that, originally we'd have been importing it at the world price of 300. Now it's going to be 330. So in other words, there's a 10% difference there. In other words, what we've got to look at is the difference between 330 and 231. So that becomes the unit value added of 99. So the calculation that we then do to look at the effective rate of protection is 99 minus 80 over 80. So it comes to 23.8% for bicycles. Notice that we're talking about the bicycle industry, and of course we assume that the bikes that are sold domestically are the same price as the bikes that are imported into the country. So that's how we do that calculation. And we do that calculation, of course, assuming as well that the domestically sold bikes also have an increase in their price of that 10%. So in other words, we assume that the country is not big enough to affect the overall price of bikes in the world. Of course, for a country like the US, that probably isn't a good assumption. We can also talk about an export tax. And, oftentimes we have agreements with countries where they, instead of instituting a tariff on their products, they agree to institute an export tax, so a tax on their own products. And that limits the amount of exports, of course, that they do. How does that work? Well, let's have a look at a world price here, initially of P0 for this country that's an exporting country. It's an exporting country, so that price must give us, if it's an exporting country for this particular product, a surplus, because that surplus is then exported. So the surplus here is S0 minus D0, and we're at the price of P0. So now we introduce a tax. Well, what effectively that does is to lower the price that the suppliers get. because of course they've got to pay the government the tax. So P0, we then subtract the tax from that, and that gives us the price that the suppliers get. So what's the change here? Well, you can see that originally the producer surplus for the foreign suppliers was that big triangle that go above the supply curve, SD, and below P0. So the foreign suppliers are going to give up, because of the tax, that area of G plus H plus J plus K plus N. So that's going to be given up by the foreign producers. We look at the consumers. The consumers are going to basically benefit by G plus H. Now, the tax is going to be paid on only the exports. So the exports are going to be that distance S1 minus D1. Notice that they've shrunk. They were S0 minus D0, they're now S1 minus D1. But the tax has to be paid on those exports. So that's K. K goes to the government. So this is like the opposite of a tariff in a way, because we've got the producers losing out, G, H, J, K, N. The consumers gaining G plus H, domestically that is, of course, because the price is going to come down for them. And the government, so they gain that, and the government gains K. So what's lost again is the areas of J plus N. That's what's lost. Once again, those little triangles there, which are what we call the efficiency losses. Let's have a look. Now, that was a small country, so it couldn't affect the world price, as you saw. For a large country, where it has monopsony power, that's going to be a different situation. So, in this case, we have to define what monopsony power is first. If a nation has a large enough share of the world's market for one of its imports that changes in the country's import buying, then changes in the country's import buying can noticeably affect the world price of the product. So in other words, it's where the trade practices of a specific country can then affect the world price. So if the country's demand for imports increases, its terms of trade deteriorate. If its import demand decreases, its terms of trade improve. So these terms of trade are the rate at which the price of imports versus the price of exports. That's what's called the terms of trade. The terms of trade effect of a tariff imposed by a large country. The large country is going to import less because the tariff increases the domestic price. So foreign prices export less, foreign firms export less and produce less. By removing the demand pressure on foreign production, the marginal cost at the smaller level of foreign production is lower. With lower marginal cost and weak demand, foreign firms will compete and lower their export price. So in this case, and this is the argument that the president, Donald Trump, has made concerning China, that you put a tariff on China, usually you would just say, okay, well, the price goes up by X percent, and because X percent is the tariff. And the Trump administration has made the point that, well, but the US is such a large purchaser in world markets that the price will not go up by just the amount of the tariff. The Chinese will be forced to eat some of the tariff. In other words, the Chinese producers themselves will have to lower their prices. And it'll eat into their profitability, not into the US firms' profitability. So to illustrate this, let's start off with our 300 being the price, that be the world price, without any tariffs. And then what we do is we apply the tariff. Now notice what happens. What happens is probably easier to see on the right hand panel. This is the standard diagram which you should have seen in your Foundations of Economics for a tariff, a tax on any good or service. The idea here being that the government takes its share, the government takes a wedge, if you like, which would be in that diagram C plus E, out of the market. That automatically reduces the amount of the product that's going to be sold. So that's the logic here. Notice what happens is that the price to the consumer goes up from 300 to 303, but the price to the supplier goes down by 3 as well, from 300 to 297. In other words, there's a tax of 6% here, or not 6%, but $6, and it's paid partially by the consumer and partially by the producer. Now let's look at the left-hand figure, where you can get a bit more intuition from what's going on with the actual welfare implications here. So let's start off with the original imports. The original imports were 1.6 minus 0.6, so that's the 1. You can see that written down as M0, and that translates over to the right-hand panel, of course. What happens then is, of course, the tariff is imposed. That pushes up the price for consumers just by 3, but it also lowers the amount that the producers get. So consumers pay 3 more, producers get 3 less. Okay, so what happens? Well, there's going to be a loss, isn't there, to consumers of A plus B plus C plus D in terms of consumer surplus. There's going to be a gain to domestic producers of basically of A, so that comes out in the wash. But then the government's going to get C and E, so C plus E. So it's a bit of a different calculation because we've got A plus B plus C plus D, or minus A plus B plus C plus D, plus A, so it's just minus B plus C plus D, but then plus C plus E. So it ends up being E minus B plus D. So E minus B plus D. So when you look at that diagram, you can see that the area E is much bigger than the area of B plus D. So that means that the actual domestic country must be gaining from that tariff. And of course, that's the Trump administration's argument that they've made with China regarding the tariff impositions that the US has put on Chinese products being imported. That in fact, it hasn't really hurt the country at all. The country, in other words, the US, has gained. Of course, China has lost, hasn't it? Because the price that they've accepted has definitely gone down. So the price from the Chinese perspective is gone down, and their producer surplus has gone down. So overall, from a global perspective, and by the way, it's gone down more than the difference of E and B plus D. So in other words, the worldwide loss is still there. It has to be there because, of course, you know, it's a tax. So a tax always results in a welfare loss. Why? Because the government's taking its cut of things and it's distorting the market. So in this case, we can look at what we think of as the nationally optimal tariff. And, you know, the nationally optimal tariff here, we can see where we were originally. So this is the kind of right-hand diagram from the previous figure. We can see the drop with the tariff going from 1 to 0.67. So the E there is the amount of revenue that the government's getting from the imports, and the net amount, sorry, and B plus D is the loss that domestically we're taking due to inefficiencies. Now, F is also a loss, of course. It's not a loss that the US bears, it's a loss that goes to foreign suppliers. So worldwide, we'd be looking at whether E is bigger than B plus D plus F. So the nationally optimal tariff is the tariff that creates the largest net gain. So E minus B plus D for the country imposing it, assuming the rest of the world is passive. Now, what do we mean by passive here? Well, just think about Trump's tariffs. Trump put the tariffs on Chinese goods. Now, what did the Chinese do? They retaliated. So the trouble with this analysis is it assumes that the Chinese don't respond. In actual fact, we know that they did respond and they started tariffing our goods. So, this analysis of an optimal tariff is only kind of as good as far as it goes, in the sense that it's a bunch of assumptions behind it. So the optimal tariff rate as a fraction of the price paid to foreigners equals the reciprocal of the price elasticity of foreign supply of the home country's imports. That's actually a result that we get from the algebra, doing the algebra. It's not something that's proven here. And, just to make the point again, there's the risk of retaliation by foreign country governments. So China's the best example here in recent months. And the other danger is that the rest of the world is worse off. So although the US might be better off, the rest of the world is much worse off compared to how much the US is better off. And the overall net, if you look at the world as a whole, is a loss because it's a tariff. Thank you for listening.